Today we're going to discuss the difficult issue of social justice in the light of the Buddhist ideals of right speech, coming right up. I'm Doug Smith of the Online Dharma Institute, that's onlinedharma.org. If you're new to this channel and interested in living a wiser and a kinder and a calmer life, consider subscribing to the channel. And if you're interested in a deeper dive into issues of who the Buddha was, what he was like, or introduction to the Buddha's teaching, check out onlinedharma.org and some of the courses I have up there. One of the hallmarks of Buddhist right speech is that it's speech that is not only truthful and meaningful, but that it's also not harsh and not divisive. These are both important aspects of Buddhist right speech. But this leads us into a sort of a difficult and fraught area of what's called nowadays tone policing, in particular online, but in various contexts nowadays. And tone policing is a topic that we can get into where basically people in marginalized communities who are pushing for social justice online are basically patronized or treated in sort of a patronizing manner by people in positions of power for basically being sort of upsetting the apple cart in various ways, for being, let's say, impolite or being too pushy, being, we might even say, divisive in quotes. And we know that one of the elements of right speech is speech that is not divisive. However, people who are pushing, again, for issues of social justice oftentimes feel, and with reason, that they need to be divisive in certain ways. They need to push on the status quo in order for things to change. And I think it's instructive here to consider Martin Luther King's 1963 letter from Birmingham jail, where he discusses a lot of issues that are relevant really to right speech, to tone policing. Of course, this is quite a long time ago, but the issues are very much contemporary. What he said was, basically, that in issues of justice, the oppressor, the person in power, never gives up willingly. They don't just simply decide to give up power. They have to be pressured into it. And indeed, when it came to him discussing these issues with people who were, that is to say, white people, I should say, who were in positions of power within various arms of the Christian church, he found them to be part of the problem. Indeed, he said in this letter, the great stumbling block in the stride towards freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. So a negative peace, which is the absence of tension. I did a recent video about right speech and free speech, in which there was an issue about whether speech should be allowed, which tends to cause problems, which tends to, let's say, cause riots or cause disturbances. And indeed, the Supreme Court had decided in one case that speech which might cause a disturbance was perhaps to be disallowed, that was not legal, in a particular place in New Hampshire at any rate. Now, these are difficult and fraught issues, there's no denying that. But there's also no denying that nonviolent civil disobedience or verbal incivility is infinitely better than violent conflict. And it was precisely the first two, that is nonviolence and verbal incivility, that Martin Luther King was after. In fact, he was not even after verbal incivility, to my knowledge. He was certainly after nonviolent protest. And indeed, within the letter to the Birmingham jail and elsewhere, Martin Luther King talked about a process of what he called self-purification that people had to go through or were expected to go through before engaging in these kinds of nonviolent demonstrations. These are issues of self-purification to make yourself realize, or to make yourself aware of the potential problems that you were going to face in nonviolent conflict, and to prepare yourself for them mentally and spiritually, to see that whether you could indeed be okay in that kind of situation. And indeed, there's, interestingly enough, a passage within the Pali Canon where the Buddha goes through exactly the same kind of issue with a young monastic who is asked to go to a distant land which is known for being violent and problematic and full of difficult people. And the Buddha then Buddha asks this monastic if he's prepared. He says, what will you do if they hit you with sticks? And the monastic says that if they hit me with sticks, I'll be very glad that they didn't throw rocks at me. And if they throw rocks at you, what will you think? I'll be very glad they didn't do something worse, and so on and so on. And it's clear after this kind of cross-examination from the Buddha that the Buddha believes that this monastic is prepared. He has gone through this process of self-purification, that he is in a state where he is appropriately ready for non-violence. So now there are many resonances here with the Buddhist notion of right speech to the way Martin Luther King looked at his kind of nonviolent approach to protest. In particular, we should consider that when it says in right speech that you're supposed to be indulging in speech which is not divisive and not abusive, we should keep in mind that for the most part the Buddha was talking about a monastic context. A context within the monastery where it was expected that monks should behave with one another in ways that were in harmony, and that whatever differences would tend to arise within a monastic context would tend to be differences based on particular preferences, particular taste, and not sort of large issues of social justice, for example. And in issues of preference, personal preference or taste, then it's better to relax and to not try to make things worse by indulging in divisive or harsh speech with one another, because clearly that's only going to inflame a situation which doesn't need to be inflamed. It's another case, however, where we're discussing speech in a sort of a broader societal context, not simply in the context, let's say, of a Buddhist monastery. However, even there and more generally, the Buddha did emphasize that when conducting ourselves in speech, there are times when things actually do get difficult. And he says, it may be that you are in a conversation with somebody who is particularly stubborn and particularly irritable. And you see that they are cleaving to some kind of action which is unskillful in various ways. And the Buddha says that if you can see or you believe that even in a longer term, by confronting this person, you can change him from behaving in an unskillful way to behaving in a skillful way, then it's right to do that, even if it will be annoying, frustrating to the person you're talking to, and indeed annoying and frustrating to yourself. Because he says, of what import is that it will be, annoying and problematic to you and to him or her if, in the longer term, you will get them settled in a much more skillful way of behaving in the world. So this is a general kind of process that you can use, the Buddha suggests that we use, even in cases where, you're gonna perhaps be saying things that may initially be offensive, may initially be problematic, may initially seem divisive because you're making somebody else angry, and indeed you're making yourself perhaps somewhat upset just by having to get involved with it. And indeed we can look to the Buddha's own behavior in situations such as these. For example, when the Buddha recognized that there were monastics who had either gotten his teachings wrong or had claimed that the Buddha had said things that he had not said, then the Buddha was not disinclined to speak very directly to them about this. And even to speak really harshly towards them. Now, is this kind of speech abusive in the sense of violating right speech? That's a matter, of course, of debate. Perhaps a matter of our own personal opinion in the matter. Some of us will see these kinds of things as somewhat abusive, and some will see them as being skillful. Skillful means towards pulling people back around towards a better way of seeing things. But nevertheless, in one famous example where the Buddha berated Aritta for getting him wrong, and this is not the only kind of example like this, it's said that Aritta sat silent, embarrassed, shoulders drooping, downcast, depressed, with nothing to say. after having been admonished by the Buddha. And indeed also, the Buddha did confront people of differing opinions, such as Brahmins, Vedic Brahmins of the day. Vedic Brahmins who claimed to accept all that the Vedas had to say based on their own faith and based on the oral tradition that they had received. And the Buddha termed this the blind leading the blind, which is a kind of a metaphor that we have both in the East and the West. It's kind of funny that this thing recurs. But in any event, that's a pretty strong statement to make. And also, the Buddha quite clearly rejected the Vedic Brahminic view of caste, the idea that there are actual castes of people and that certain people are better than others based upon their birth and the birth of their parents back 7 generations. The Buddha was quite strict and quite strong in rejecting this kind of opinion. Indeed, he rejected this opinion as unjust, in much the same way that people who agitate for social justice today may argue that certain aspects of our own society are unjust. Nevertheless, we have to keep in mind also that the Buddha did say that, he said, it's not I who argue with the world, it's the world that argues with me. In the sense that the Buddha didn't go out into society to argue with people, to argue with Vedic Brahmins, let's say. He waited for them to come to him. And it's also the case that in order to shall we say, set up a society in which Vedic Brahmanism did not have any kind of hold, insofar as the caste system didn't have a hold, he set up the Sangha, this monastic order, which was really quite separate from society. So it was like he was setting up a sort of a separate, we might say, almost perfected, or at least a better society, more just society within ordinary unjust society, where he could indeed basically banish the idea of caste, and also where he could pursue in more depth the ideal of self-purification, because that was the whole point of the Sangha, after all, was to be a place where the monks could practice self-purification really 24/7, if you like. And so there's a kind of a difference in, we would say, balance, let's say, between the Buddha and Martin Luther King as regards the issues of social agitation and self-purification. For Martin Luther King, self-purification was important, but social agitation was at least as important and indeed more important for him. I mean, as long as people had gone through some of a process of self-purification, then social agitation was the necessary second step. For the Buddha, it was more the other way around, where self-purification was more important, and social agitation was something that he didn't really pursue very much, except insofar as he really isolated the monastics from the outside society, at least partially. Now, of course, they had to be in contact with the society in order to get alms. They would go on alms round in order to get food, because they were not allowed to feed themselves. They had to get clothing and so on. But the idea was that they were sort of in a semi-separate kind of situation. Now, we have to also be aware that the society of ancient India 2,500 years ago is very, very different from the society today in many, many respects. It seems as though Vedic Brahmanism was not dominant in the area that the Buddha taught. It was a kind of an outsider influence. There certainly were Vedic Brahmins in the area, but they did not dominate society to the extent that they were, a real important issue of justice in a very real sense, and they certainly didn't dominate society enough so that the Buddha was not allowed to do what he wanted. So the Buddha did have the benefit of the protection of powerful and influential people that allowed him to set up the Sangha, that allowed him to fund the Sangha in the sense of building houses and so on, and feeding people and so on. So he was in a situation very different from our own, and we have to keep that in mind. And partially these differences allowed the Buddha to set up this separate society, or somewhat separate society, in which people could pursue self-purification on a grand scale. I don't know whether such a thing is really possible in the West at this point. It might be, but it would certainly be more difficult than it was in ancient India, where this kind of activity was more established and more understood. Now, there's another also part of the Buddha's approach to, let's say, social agitation, which is that speech of any kind, and particularly, let's say, a speech of a more difficult and harsh kind, or a pointed kind, like the Buddha suggested with people who are difficult, should be undertaken with a mind of loving kindness, which is a tall order for most of us, because oftentimes when we're confronted with people of hate-filled kinds of ideologies, we tend to be drawn into the hate ourselves. But certainly this is one of the aspects of self-purification that the Buddha suggested, is that if we are going to confront someone, we should confront them with the right mindset. We should confront them with the mindset that we're actually trying to help them. We're trying to make them better people. We're not trying to harm them. Now, I mean, and this kind of mindset can turn over on itself, where we go from a position of feeling like, okay, we're coming from a position of justice and we're trying to help them see ethical justice the way it should be and behave justly and behave in ethical ways, which is to their own benefit. We can sort of switch from that kind of more loving kind of opinion or approach to one where we're just so filled with anger towards other people who disagree with us that we're actually trying to hurt them. And if we're trying to hurt them, and if our language is simply trying to hurt them rather than trying to draw them into a better state of being, then we're really not going to be as effective, and all we're going to be doing is expanding hatred. And this is one of the things that Martin Luther King understood quite well himself. And now here's a really important thing to keep in mind, is that once we understand this kind of speech in that way, we'll see that this kind of speech is not really abusive or divisive in the senses that violate right speech. Abusive or divisive speech is really speech that is intended to harm or is intended to divide one person from another. What we're trying to do with right speech, even in difficult situations and issues of social justice, is not to harm them, but actually make them better people. And we're not trying to divide one person from another, but in fact we're trying to bring people together. We're trying to overcome divisions based upon such things as race or sex or sexual orientation or gender identity or whatever it happens to be, many of these things, trying to bring people together as one humanity, rather than divide people based upon, let's say, caste, like in the old days. These are the really divisive types of speech, or are speech that is intended to divide one person from another. And here's the issue with tone policing, which is that sometimes bringing this kind of justice to fruition, making people more skillful in their beliefs and in their actions and their speech, can involve a certain amount of temporary incivility, a certain amount of temporary impoliteness or harsh tone. That is that can be part of the process. Just as the Buddha said, sometimes you have to argue with somebody who is going to be stubborn, and in that case, it's okay to be a little harsh in your tone. I mean, you may need to be. That's going to happen. But we have to be careful to understand what kind of circumstances this happens under, because it's simply a matter of I think not much dispute that most of the harshness and incivility and difficulty that we see online has nothing to do with these issues. It simply has to do with trolling of various kinds. And trolls are people who are simply disruptive in order to be disruptive. They're people who come from anger, who come from a place of hatred, who come from a place of simply wanting to divide one person from another. And oftentimes they even may speak as though they're in favor of social justice. I shouldn't say often, but sometimes that's a way of trolling that's just being insincere. And trolls, of course, have to be dealt with pretty quickly and severely online, because if you don't deal with a troll severely, they're going to basically disrupt discussion and make it impossible to have any kind of discussion. The point here is that sometimes disharmony is necessary in the service of justice. Sometimes disharmony is necessary, and we expect this disharmony to be temporary as people begin to understand the points that are being made. But otherwise, I think we should not be creating unnecessary disharmony, and that's part of the point of Buddhist right speech, is that disharmony in the service of justice, disharmony in the service of bringing people to a better state of being, a more skillful state of being, is justified. But otherwise, we should avoid it. If you find these talks of mine useful, check out my Patreon page and help support this this program we're all undergoing and doing together. Give it a thumbs up, consider subscribing if you're not subscribed, share these videos if you like them, and I hope we'll catch you on the next one. And meanwhile, all of you, be well.